All right, let's talk about Samson. He is one of the most famous characters of the Hebrew Bible. And even, well, I shouldn't say more importantly, but pretty cool. We got a question from one of our followers and named Baden, who reached out on Instagram. And he has a question, and we're going to address that today. And I think everyone will be interested because who doesn't love Samson? So Baden reached out. He said, "Hey, love the channel. Hey, we love you. Thank you. Don't know if you guys do requests. Yes, we do. But I'm seriously interested in the Hebrew Bible's insights on Samson and what he stood for. I tried speaking to a couple of people about him, but nobody seems to know much other than the basic story." He also asked a question that we will get into as well. It's kind of specific. He said, "I've heard Samson comes from Shamash, which means sun."
Good for him.
The one in the, out in outer space. Apparently in Hebrew, and he was named that because he had a special connection with God, ? So we got some fun things to dig into today. You excited to talk about Samson?
No, I'm very excited to talk about Shimshon. Yes, Samson himself. This will be good. Good episode. So
yeah, that's a great place to start, by the way. I love learning the names of biblical characters and what their names sound like in Hebrew. I think that's just so cool.
It is.
In fact, every name, like, I feel like when people are outside of the famous people, when you're reading genealogies or some random person's son or daughter, and they have a name that's impossible to pronounce, it's like, how do you say that? I mean, when I look at it in English, I don't get it. And so even now, after all my training, I look at the English, I don't know. Let me see the Hebrew. Oh, of course. And then the Hebrew flows beautifully and makes sense.
That's correct. Same with place names, right? When you're mentioning cities or anything of that sort, it can be very difficult once you've learned Hebrew to not trip up when you're reading it in English. I usually just default to the Hebrew when I'm reading in English. I just think it's easier. So
that's right. That's what we do here at Hebrew Bible Insights.
So, that's right. Shimshon. What a nice name coming from Shamash. So there's very interesting ideas surrounding it, which we're going to get into here. So
I thought, let's just talk about Judges first.
Let's do that.
Picture,
yeah.
A little context.
Mm-hmm.
I recently got your top 5 strength finder, and context was really high for you, which makes so much sense because you're all about the ancient Near East context.
Yes, everything needs to be in context. That's our problem today. We don't put things into context, I think. So, no, it's very much part of my life.
We haven't talked out all the specifics. So I'm very curious what you're going to say. Curious what I'll say. When I think about Judges, I actually really like this book. I know it's kind of viewed as like it's the thing that's like stuffed away in like, it's Bruno. That's what it is. It's Bruno. I don't know if you guys have seen the Encanto movie. We don't talk about Bruno.
Have I seen that? I don't know if I have seen that. No.
Maybe your kids are barely not old enough. But anyway, it's everybody's seen it, especially people that have kids. It's just Disney's movie. And anyway, we don't talk about Bruno, some of those, pop songs going around right now. And so anyway, Judges, I feel like we have a few characters we love to talk about, but otherwise there are parts in the book like, no, we're not at the end of Judges. Let's stay away, kids. Let's, let's not talk about this book.
Yeah.
But I really love it. I mean, it's probably one of my favorite books in the Hebrew Bible overall. I find it really telling. There's a lot of great lessons to learn from this. This part of Israel's history is fascinating to me. What's your impression of Judges just as a whole? Are you very interested in it, or where does it rank for you? Or
I do find it very interesting. I think it's coming off of Joshua, sort of coming off the Torah, especially Deuteronomy into Joshua, and then we have this era here, obviously that we call the Shoftim or the Judges, and that then leading into the Samuel tradition, which when we come to a king, I think is quite fascinating, because here we are in this moment where the writer of these particular texts, or the redactor, the editor, however we want to frame that particular element with regard to the Judges, wants us to know that there is no king in Israel at this point. And it's an interesting statement that this is a time in which there was no king in Israel. And that everybody is doing what is right in their own eyes, and whatnot. So it's very interesting to me that the writer, whoever's really putting that in there to make the point that we are leading to that moment when Israel finally has a king. But of course, Israel has a king. They have a king right now. The Lord is their king. Good. He's dwelling in their midst. They have the presence of the Creator, God, living in their midst, just like what happens in Exodus 40 in the tabernacle. How we say Exodus 40 is like the new Garden of Eden, right? It's Gan Eden again. We lost it. We're back at it at Exodus 40 with the construction of the tabernacle and God's presence dwelling in the midst of it. And now the question is, can Israel sustain this marvelous thing that's happened in their midst? Can they be a people with God dwelling as king in their midst? And Judges is really asking that particular question. So I think it's a fascinating book. It is. I always say this: you can't get to the rest of the narrative that's coming without first going through, of course, Joshua, but Judges, right? So
I think it's a great connection back to Exodus 40 because, oh man, it's so true. They do already have a king. And one thing I think about is the expectation we have out of Joshua, to me, is very, very high expectations. We're finally getting to the promised land. We're finally at the home base for this epic mission that God talked about hundreds of years prior with Abraham. Yeah. And I think our expectation is that we're finally going to be at that place that really matters for the plot of the story. Things are going to get better. Things are going to be great. And instead we find the opposite. And I really like post-apocalyptic stories. I love the morality stuff that goes on with them. It's really interesting. I know it's not for everybody, but I love when it's like, oh, sorry, I actually bumped into you at the gas station. Oh, here, you go in first. Oh, you grab the water first, right? Because there's 1,000 water bottles there. But if it's like a post-apocalyptic thing, there's only one water bottle left. It's you or that other person. What are you going to do? Anyway, Judges, to me, it feels like post-apocalyptic morality in quote unquote paradise. It's the place that's supposed to be this. I think in a way it's supposed to be that Garden of Eden again. I think that's the expectation we have. And instead we have morality that matches a post-atomic bomb, fictional post-apocalyptic movie. And it's very dark, but God still moves in this book.
He does. There's other elements too, I think, on those levels is, I don't know. In the Western world, I tend to, or at least from popular preaching today, I get the sense nobody really likes the Judges. I mean, there's a sense in which this era of time in Israel's history is not so great. And of course, there's truth to it. But we really should kind of just stay away from it altogether. But there's another element I like, especially in my own research, and of course, I've talked about this before, the hermeneutical principle of divine retribution as the structuring element for Hebrew historiography. So again, so the whole point, and this is when you realize this about ancient Near Eastern history, that they are structuring, all history is structured according to the hermeneutical principle of divine retribution. That is, you tell the story of history according to the divine's retribution for good or bad. So if the divine realm brings a curse or a blessing, the history is laid out in that particular way. This is true of all of the Hebrew Bible. It's true of what we call the Deuteronomistic history. So if we're going from Joshua to 2 Kings, where 2 Kings ends with the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, that whole narrative is structured according to that hermeneutical principle, and you can follow it all the way along. But the truth is, even the smaller narratives are doing just that. And what we forget about here in Judges is that, yes, God does raise up deliverers to deliver Israel from the plight that they are in each of these particular narratives and stories that we're going through. But we forget that the story and the narrative is set up in such a way that God is the one who brings the hardship to begin with because of their unfaithfulness to the covenant. We have that sort of back and forth play that is going on, and it is, again, that structuring element to show us, just like in the Exodus, that God is in control of order. He's in control of bringing about the good in these particular narratives, and that is his ultimate hope. But Israel must be faithful to the covenant. So
that's so good. And I think that's probably one of the most helpful principles for understanding historiography and pretty much all the narrative of the Hebrew Bible. Is if we can understand that element, we understand what's the point. What are these narratives primarily leading toward? Like, for example, okay, so whenever the exile happens at the end of 2 Kings, is the author's point is not we were exiled because Babylon is just bigger and we're weaker.
Right.
It's we are going into exile because we were unfaithful to God.
Yeah.
And so it's all this structuring around
It's
the
fascinating.
Lord
Yeah.
and us to him. And like you said, you can follow every piece of the narrative. In fact, I wonder, could you open up on accordance Judges chapter 2? I think that probably would be worth reading. So Judges 2:11. Then the Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and they worshiped the Baals. Yeah, the plural of Baal. That's probably fun to dig into as well. But just, other gods we'll say for now. And worship the Baals. And they abandoned the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They followed other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were all around them and bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. They abandoned the Lord and worshiped Baal. And that's an interesting spelling for that. Astartes? Isn't that like Ashtaroth? Okay, that's interesting. I've never seen that transliteration for Ashtaroth.
They would spell it that way. Yeah, the Ashtoreth.
Okay, the Ashtoreth. Okay, and then verse 14. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to the plunderers who plundered them, and he sold them into the power of their enemies all around, so that they could no longer withstand their enemies. Whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them to bring them misfortune, as the Lord had warned them and sworn to them, and they were in great distress.
Yeah. So see,
go ahead.
Well, sorry. I mean, it's right there. It's very interesting in that particular phrase is that you see that it's hard to get across the grammar there because the grammar is making it very clear that the structure, according to the hermeneutical principle of divine retribution, assumes, of course, that the Lord has put this misfortune on them because of unfaithfulness to the covenant. But if you go back to the covenant curses, it makes sense because it's using the similar language that is used in the curses themselves. Okay, now verse 16, go ahead. Yep.
That's good. Good point. Then the Lord raised up judges who delivered them out of the power of those who plundered them. Yet they did not listen even to their judges, for they lusted after other gods and bowed down to them. They soon turned aside from the way in which their ancestors had walked, who had obeyed the commandments of the Lord. They did not follow their example. And whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge, and he delivered them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge, for the Lord would be moved to pity by their groaning because of those who persecuted and oppressed them. But whenever the judge died, they would relapse and behave worse than their ancestors, following other gods, worshiping them and bowing down to them. They would not drop any of their practices or their stubborn ways. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. And he said, because this people have transgressed my covenant, there goes back to what you just said, that I commanded their ancestors and have not obeyed my voice, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations. So I feel like this kind of narrative shows they're kind of giving a summary of how the rest of the book is going to go. It's like, hey, why were these other Canaanite people? Why did they attack and why did they conquer them? It's because they were disobeying. They weren't following God, and that's why these people came. And then why were they able to then regain their land and their freedom from these Canaanite plunderers and people attacking? Well, because God raised up a judge and worked through that judge. And then during the life period of that judge, they would follow the Lord. But then why would they get attacked again? Well, because they didn't follow the Lord.
Yeah. And that's what happens when you place these particular texts in the way that you do in light of the covenant, because that's what, it's what scholars call the Deuteronomistic historian. They want us to see that the historian is expecting us to see that the interpretation of the events that are happening on the ground on a historical level, right, as we see them, are so because the Lord is in control of both the Tov and the Ra in this particular sense. On a historical level, not every action, right, we talked about this, but definitely on the historical level, you see that happening here in the Judges to lay out the story of why these things are happening and where it may be going. So it's a very important point. And obviously this writer or editor, it goes to great lengths here to lay this out before we move in, right? And especially before we get to the final judge, Samson, which is what we're going to talk about. But we should go to judges here. What do we think about this? Why a judge? We have a malach. We could just go straight to a king.
Yep. Why not have a melech, right? That'd be fine.
Right.
In fact, before we even say why a judge, we should even say, what is a
What is a
judge?
judge? Well,
Because let's be honest, this went like I'm expecting, I'm not expecting Deborah, I'm expecting Judge Judy. I'm like, right? Like, okay, it's a
yeah.
bunch of courtroom stories, and here come the contestants. They come in, they got their case, and they go before them.
Yeah.
So, but
But
instead we
that's
have
not.
often warriors.
Yeah,
Go
well,
ahead.
now this is interesting. That's actually not a bad place to start with Judge Judy, because in fact, if we follow the common Semitic root of Shaphat all the way back, we can see that in the earliest times it did refer to that administrative role of offering judgment in the midst of cases. That is really where it seems to begin. Shapitum in Akkadian, we have that as an actual role. But there comes a moment when, especially a little later on, but we see it already in the Mari letters, that the Shapitum are actually close to the Sharum and other leaders, Sharum being a word for king.
Mhm.
And so it's sort of this step up from just straight administering of justice, but to ruling and governing
Hmm.
as well. And even though this is interesting too, in the Mari letters, the Shapitum could be military leaders as well.
Oh, interesting.
Could be referred to as military leaders. So here we have an emphasis in which judges, even in the time of Mari, we're talking around the 19th, 18th centuries BCE, so 1800s, 1700s BCE, we have Akkadian texts in, what is northern Mesopotamia, right there in Syria. We have texts that really make it clear that the Shafat or a Shapitum could in fact be a military leader, which is very close to what we have in the judges.
Wow. So it's totally comparable then. I mean, because those Mari
It
texts,
is.
close
Yes.
region, close in time,
Yeah.
same Semitic language, and so the fact that we have Hebrew people being called a shofet, that are having a mixture of what we would typically call judging, along with leadership, military role, totally fits the
It
context.
does. It does. Yeah. No, it does. And you kind of get this with Moses, don't you? I mean, Moshe himself sort of plays this role. We have Exodus 18, where he's a
Yeah.
judge, but he's also a military leader, even though the Lord is the one who's plundering Egypt in that story. So,
Well, no, I was going to bring up Moses actually. I think he's a good example because obviously he's a leader, and they do have a fight against the Amalekites. And also, we have the Jethro story where we see how people are bringing their cases before Moses, and he's making
correct.
decisions.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so he, in a way, is doing all three of those things.
That's a great point. Yeah.
So how about this then? How about we talk about the noun justice, mishpat, comes from the same root. We've been thinking about this a lot recently due to some, senior paper presentations and whatnot. So when we think about how would we review this? Like, how would we take a moment to look at the noun shofet, judge, as someone who does justice, mishpat, and I know that can be a loaded word in English. Like, what does that refer to?
Correct.
But I think that's an important idea for maybe a way to encapsulate all these things is what's the ideal in the ancient Near East in general, as well as in the Hebrew Bible, when we're looking to someone who's this leader. Maybe they're judging, maybe they're doing war. Like, what's the goal of someone? What's the vision of a world of justice, in the ancient Near East?
It's a great question. I think I think at the core we do with mishpat, we can take it to the very base level of reward and punishment. I make that very clear in my own argument, and I can lay that out. But on a higher level beyond that, because then you say, well, what's the point of that? Is it just for that purpose? And it's no. The point is the establishment, I think, of order and wisdom in the earth. And I think we talked about this, where the doing of mishpat in the sense of justice, i.e. for reward or punishment, we go back to that administrative role of implementing that, is for the purpose of sort of the maintenance, I guess, of wisdom, or the implementation fully of wisdom in the earth when wisdom has been broken on some level or has been transgressed, I guess you would say.
That's good.
And I think this makes good sense when you think about the ancient Near Eastern law codes, especially, where these law codes they are the ideal. They're not meant to be taken so literally, but it is sort of the ideal of how wisdom should be understood in the ancient Near East, in any locale that we are in. And I think the same is true of the Torah, right? Of what God brings forth in the Torah, that we have that ideal of the covenant. And so when Israel is being unfaithful, like we have here in the Judges, we need God to bring forth someone to bring the maintenance, I guess, in order to reestablish that element of wisdom, I think, in Israel. What do you think?
I think that's really well said. Yeah, it's this. I guess if I had to put it in different words, I think the idea of God has a vision of what is right and what is good and what is wise, and someone who is a judge, they take action so that other people then see the world that same way. So everyone starts realizing, no, that is corruption. Okay, that is not wise. And then take action to change that and to make those things right. And ultimately, for the Hebrew Bible authors, that is lining things up in the way of how God sees things, how God wants things. Ancient Near East, we can look at their law codes and see what their ideal is based on different reasons.
Yeah.
But for the authors of Hebrew Bible, we want to line up reality in a way that lines up with what God's will is. And for him as the ultimate judge of all, which that goes back to, there's a judge in the garden, right?
Yeah,
there's
right, exactly.
and that is the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess then we could say, yeah, it is unique that the book of Judges so often calls these specific figures of a unique time in history by Shofet. But you could say that, you can apply that word to other biblical characters throughout the Hebrew Bible, and that they're kind of doing that role in some way. This makes me wish I had already done a tract that the noun shofet throughout the Hebrew Bible. Maybe we'll do that in an upcoming episode.
We could do that.
To look at.
Yeah.
So
I think that's a good point, though. I just want to add on to that, because I think shofet, and even Chapitum in the Mari letters, I think it's a lesser role. I don't think it's as high as saying Sharum, for example, king in Akkadian, or Melech in Hebrew. I don't think it's as high as that. But I do think those particular offices do participate in the role of the Shofet or the Chapitum in that sense. So,
and that would make sense, I guess, in the Mari letters, and also within the book of Judges, because it's still written there, but there was no king, there was no king.
Correct. Yeah.
And that is an important point.
It is.
So cool. Well, obviously the time period of Judges is one that we need justice, because when you look through the book, we already read chapter 2 that really emphasizes the worship of foreign gods. It should also be pointed out, though, especially the end of Judges, we see there's a lot of violence and rape and all sorts of messed up stuff in terms of just the morality, ethics on the ground level of Israel that's happening. There's a lot of need in this time period for someone to come in. And so I guess that might bring at least some resolution for now for this conversation on why Judges and what are Judges.
Yeah, there's also on an ancient Near Eastern level, we have, depending on where, if we put the book of Judges where we probably should put it historically, where it claims to be, if we put Moses where Moses would be, we're right, especially towards the end of Judges, we have the complete dissolution of the ancient Near East. It completely dissolves. The ancient Near East just goes dark around 1150 BCE. So right before Samuel, right before the time of David, we have this just undoing of the ancient Near East. It was probably a process of time that it was happening. And it actually fits Judges quite well, where we had the Hittite Empire just disappeared during this time. Ugarit, which was a city-state up in northwest Syria, right on the coast, it disappears as well. We know the land of Canaan is in turmoil. Egypt does not disappear, but it's diminished greatly during this time. And it fits right in here with the Judges as well. So
how fascinating. And that, I guess, then gives space for Israel to kind of become its own little kingdom in Canaan, then, with all these superpowers having either completely fallen off the map or having to recede a little bit. It just makes sense historically. So that's so interesting.
Yeah, once we get there. So
back to the book of Judges, I think one tad bit that's kind of just interesting to me is you have 6 oppressors. And if you count the Philistines are mentioned twice as being an oppressor at two different parts. So
Mhm.
you could view it as 7, but it's technically 6 people groups that attack 7 times. And then we have 12 judges. Now, what's interesting to me is you have the 12 tribes of Israel,
Mm.
and they're not all covered, by the way, in the book. I think it's important to mention, like, often each life of the judge it's a certain region of Israel where activity is happening that may or may not be related to other parts. They're still not united, which I think that's also another problem, kind of the way that Judges portrays everything is
That's
Israel's
true.
not united.
That is true. Yeah.
I don't know what the right word would be. City state feels way too
Well,
much to
city.
describe what they were. What do you think? I
Yeah.
mean, maybe it is appropriate. How would you describe the Israel's governmental status at this
It's
point?
almost like a united federation. It's like a federation or something, isn't it? Like
Okay.
there's this. You have the tribal federations. You have these different tribes, and they are
Yeah.
united. It
Yeah.
seems under this covenantal code, this Deuteronomy, essentially, right?
Yeah.
This code that they have, but. Of course, we must remember this is a large geographical area, especially for that time period. It's not like it is today. The tribes were all very unique. They had different ways of going about life, it seems. So that's why you get the various expressions that you get. But I think on a political level, the idea is that God is definitely ruling. But we don't have that uniting king, I think. And I think that's where
Yeah.
the idea is going to lead, that the king's going to really unite the tribes in a way that hadn't happened
Yeah.
before. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
That's good.
And that's what we
really
have
good.
here, because as we're going to get to the end of Judges, the tribe of Benjamin's going to do something very awful, like you mentioned,
Yeah.
in Judges 19. And they're going to receive the retribution of the other tribes who have to bring the maintenance, or God's going to do it himself. So, yeah.
What's interesting is there's kind of a bookend thing, I think, with Judges, where at the very beginning you have chapter 1 starts with this question where they ask God a question: who will ascend and go up to go to war with this little Canaanite group?
Mm-hmm.
And so you have tribes unifying together to fight against Canaanites. But then at the end of the book, we have the same question is asked of God: who will go up with us? But this time they're uniting themselves together to fight against Benjamin. And
Yeah.
then that tribe is almost wiped out.
That's right.
And so we start with maybe a story of unity to get, to continue to establish themselves in the promised land.
Mm-hmm.
But at the end, we have unity for almost killing each other. And Benjamin
Yeah.
is almost completely wiped out. And they have to make a plan so the whole tribe doesn't get wiped out. And then interestingly, the first king of Israel comes from Benjamin. I find that interesting why that connection would be there.
Mm-hmm.
So Samson, he is, to finally find a way to answer the question, which Baden, by the way, I hope I'm pronouncing Baden's name correctly. It was great connecting with you on Instagram. I think he's from Australia. So getting to Samson, he's the 12th. He is the last final judge, which I think is interesting. And he's kind of set apart in a few ways. One is that he is the only one who gets this special birth narrative where angel of the Lord appears to his mom, and in fact appears to her multiple times. And so he has a special birth narrative, which I think there's some fun stuff we could talk about there. Samson's also the only one who seems to have superhuman abilities, where the other ones got raised up and they did incredible things. But Samson, the power scale is a whole different level of what he was able to do. And obviously his story is very famous. There's a lot of fun stuff we can get into with this. We can't cover everything, obviously. No. You can never do that, but I think let's just talk about Samson and let's see what's interesting. What do we want to talk about? What do we want to dive into?
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything you want to start with when it comes to Samson?
Well, I think we should start with the name, because I think it's fascinating that Shimshon, being derived from Shamash, something like a little son. But the fact that we're in, we have a Mesopotamian god named Shamash, right? Shamash, of course, refers to the sun also, the orb in the sky that burns, right? It refers to that in one sense, the word Shamash, but in another sense, when we bring a mythological element into it, it is Shamash, the god of justice. So I think it's very interesting that we have Shimshon, the last judge, his name, though not in Hebrew, but certainly if you think about it from a Mesopotamian level, you definitely have this idea of justice also tied even to the name itself.
Well, how about this? Think of Psalm 19, where this psalm that is dedicated to the beauty of the Torah of the Lord, and
Mm.
being compared to the sun. That the first part of Psalm 19, you have the sun that comes. I wonder if you can just pull it up real quick. Maybe
Yeah,
we
yeah,
could
yeah. I
look at
definitely
a
could.
few
Let's do it
lines.
here.
Again, let's give English translation here. Psalm 19. The heavens are telling the glory of God, and the firmament proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours forth speech, and night to night declares knowledge. There is no speech, nor their words. Their voice is not heard, yet their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the earth. In the heavens, he has set a tent for the sun, which comes out like a bridegroom from his wedding canopy, and like a strong man runs its course with joy. Its rising is from the end of the heavens, and its circuit to the end of them, and nothing is hid from its heat. And so we go from this first part talking about the heavens and particular emphasis on the sun, and then we
Yeah.
switch the law, or here the Torah. The Torah of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul.
It's a
The
fascinating
decrees,
transition there. That's really
yeah, isn't
interesting.
that?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we go from
Yeah,
talking
it
about the
is.
sun, to then talk about
Uh-huh.
the Torah of God, and
Yeah.
this similarity that we have
Yeah.
going on.
Yeah.
So, and you go through the rest. The rest just basically describes just a lot of beautiful attributes of God's guidance, His
Mm-hmm.
truth, and whatnot. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
So yeah, I mean, it's interesting to see that there because we have we have the Shamash, right? We have the sun, but there's no mythological element. There's no way in which there is a god of justice behind it. But we see that the Lord in His law is the one bringing forth justice, and it is the Lord who shines sort of into the dark places, just like I guess Shamash does in Mesopotamian mythology and ideas. So, but here it is Shimshon, right?
yeah.
It is Samson who's going to do the great works of God here in this particular story.
You know, I wonder. So we know what his name. You know, it's play on the word for son, but we don't have like a. And they named him Samson
No,
because this.
yeah,
So we don't have
yeah.
that. But so this could be reading into things a little bit. But what I wonder if this is almost setting up a narrative expectation where Judges is known as, again, being a very dark period.
Mm-hmm.
And if so again, I'm kind of moving away from the text a bit to like interpretive level. So again, I could be reading into this a tad bit, but it's a very
Mm-hmm.
dark period.
Yeah,
And if you have this 12th judge, this final one, who has epic birth narrative named Shimshon, we're expecting him to bring the light into this dark period. We're expecting him to be that person who'll be the light that shines in the darkness. And spoiler alert, he's not. But I wonder if there's a tad bit of his name. It gives us a hope and an expectation of what will happen.
Well, it's an interesting idea, especially when we bring. Let's talk about Delilah's name for a moment.
Yes. Yes, that's good.
There's a lot of discussion here with Delilah, but we'll just go with the first part. The Lila is interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Lila being the word for night. Yeah. So.
Yep. And then the Dalet at the beginning, one thing I've wondered is in Aramaic, D is like of, or a myriad of things. It means many things in Aramaic. But Delilah, I got to look at her name again. Is it Delilah? I forget the exact vowel for her.
Let me
I
look
think
it
it may
up
be
here.
chapter, maybe it's Judges chapter 16 when she comes in.
Yeah, I think
15. So. I should have already remembered this. I mean, I read through the chapters in Hebrew.
I think it was 16
days ago.
Yeah.
Again, vowels aren't like the most important thing in Hebrew. We know they're kind of finicky a little bit.
What is it? It's Delilah. Yeah, you had it right.
Delilah.
Yeah.
But anyway, obviously Lila is the, like, again, if you take her name, it's her name.
Correct.
Is the consonantal text is the word night, and then you just add a dot at the beginning. So I wonder if there's a way you could look at it. She is of the night, you could say, is
which has multiple connotations for Delilah in any case. Could be from the Akkadian Dalilu, but yeah. I mean, there's all sorts of interesting ideas behind names and narratives. I mean, you can always, like you said, read into it a bit too much. But in any case, here there's something interesting. We have a guy, Shamash, and he's going to get in trouble with a woman. With Lila there in some sense. So, yeah.
So yeah, there's some fun stuff with the names. So yeah, I think some cool possibilities. But all to say that the judges, we should say it doesn't spell it out for us. It
Yep.
doesn't tell us exactly. So there's
No.
going to be interpretive work and guesswork, but
it doesn't give us a narrative explaining the etymology of the name, does it? It's just not there. Yeah. So what about his unique birth? You mentioned that. So I think that's fascinating too.
yeah, so interesting. So first off, you have Malach Adonai, the angel of the Lord. So we know that we have obviously the Lord, there are angels, there are other divine beings. Malach Adonai is a relatively rare divine being that appears in multiple stories, such as appears to Hagar, appears to Samson's mom, appears to Moses. Well, I should have skipped, appears to Moses in the burning bush. And so it's interesting wherever this character appears. And sure enough, he appears to Samson's mom and basically says, "Hey, look, you're barren, but you're going to have a kid." And then also tells her, "Hey, don't cut his hair, don't drink wine or strong drink. He is going to be a Nazareth and someone who is dedicated to God in some special way." And a little fun note, I think she tells her husband. Her husband, to me, he's an interesting guy. I don't think he really believes her. He's not really sure. He's like, "Hey, let's see if he comes back. Okay, let's pray to God and see if we can have this experience again." I'm not really sure if I know exactly what you said is true or not. Again, I'm kind of summarizing things and filling in some stuff. So then they're like, okay, and the angel Lord appears again, but only to the wife, which, by the way, she doesn't have a name. She's just Manoach's wife, and so appears to Manoach's wife again. And the text explicitly says, but her husband was not with her. And it's just interesting that the angel would choose to appear to her again.
Yeah.
Her husband's not with her. So they have a conversation. And she calls her husband, "Hey, come on over here." And so they have a conversation. But the Manoach does not think that this is an angel of the Lord or any sort of divine being. He thinks he's just a person. And they have a meal. They have a conversation. And he's like, "Hey, so are we going to have a son?" The guy's like, "Yep." "All right, what are we supposed to do?" And he says, "Everything I commanded your wife to do, that's what you guys are going to do." So again, the conversation is pointed back. The stuff I said to your wife, again, he does explain some of it too, though, to him. And then they're like, "Hey, let's have a meal." And the angel of the Lord says, "No, I won't be eating with you guys, but if you make a sacrifice to the Lord." I think that's a point worth mentioning, by the way. In this period of history, we have a lot of sacrifices going on that aren't to the Lord. And I think it's interesting that we'd have just a tad bit of this person, if you're going to make a sacrifice to the Lord. And so he does. And then this angel of the Lord gets caught up in the flames of I have to read the Hebrew again to see exactly what's going on. But the picture I get is that he, his divine being guy just goes up into these flames and goes up into the sky and just disappears. And then the husband, Manoach, he just freaks out. He's like, "Oh my gosh, that was the angel of the Lord. You were right." And then he starts freaking out. And he's like, "Oh, he's going to kill us. We're dead. We're done." And so I get this picture. This guy doesn't trust his wife and he doesn't really understand God very well. But his wife responds saying, No, he's not going to kill us. If he wanted to do that, he would have done that long ago. And so she seems to have a little bit more of a trust in God, a little more understanding. And then anyway, you have the birth of Samson.
Yeah. It's a fascinating story. And of course, here we have a barren woman again, who wants to have a child. That's sort of a lesser character in the narrative, but really the premier character nonetheless, right? I mean, that's sort of how these narratives move. We had that with Hannah. We could think of Hannah that's going to come later here soon. We have a very similar narrative where Hannah is barren and really, really wants a son and dedicates the son to the Lord. A different story, nevertheless, somewhat similar. And then, of course, we have, and then, like you said, we have Mary in the New Testament, right? Yeah. We talked about this. So,
which something I wish I'd circled back to, by the way. Again, this could have been me reading into something, to this idea that Samson being the light in this dark period is, let's just say there's some validity to that idea. I think where our mind should go to is realizing that there is one who was the light that shone in the darkness. The darkness could not overcome, comprehend it, that being Jesus. So Anyway, just your connection to Mary again made me want to make sure.
I think it's fine because we are dealing with Christian scripture on one level too. So I think it's a nice comparison and a nice correlation with what we have coming in the New Testament. But it is, I think, as far as Samson being this last great judge of Israel in this particular story, it is fitting that it ends with the Philistines, right? Because these are going to be sort of in the later stories with David and others going to be really part of the enemy of Israel that's going to be central to some of the other narratives to come. And so that it ends back here again with the Philistines, I think is quite interesting. Also interesting for the time because we think that the Philistines, in fact, are what we call the sea peoples. Not quite clear where they come from, but they think that this may have been part of the reason for the collapse of the Near East during that time because of the invasions of the sea peoples and the instability that it caused. But nevertheless, it's clear that they are already established in the land here, and fascinating that it comes here to this at the end. So, but yeah, the birth story, we have a sort of very important birth story. And it seems that Samson's going to be, like you said, a Nazarene dedicated unto the Lord. It's going to be different than the other judges, but it just doesn't end the way that it should, right?
No.
That's the feel you get from it. Some of the other judges, it's as if the Lord comes to them. They're not that great of a character, but by the end, boy, are they a great character, you know? Samson, we get this magnificent beginning, and even his actions at the start of the narrative that we read are wonderful, and they decline from there, don't they?
Yeah.
It's sort of like the whole story of Samson is a narrative of decline because it starts wonderfully and it ends pretty much badly, you know.
It really does. Yeah, his is so interesting. I'm remembering a comment that when the Spirit of the Lord comes upon a judge, and you have that Spirit of the Lord quite a bit through the book of Judges, there'll be a verb associated with that. And Samson gets a unique one, and which is the PL of Pa'am. And rare as a verb, always in the ni file, except for here, if I remember right. And it's a word that has the ideas of being disturbed or bothered. And it's often in dream stories, like with Joseph, the Pharaoh during the story of Joseph, or Nebuchadnezzar, that they are disturbed and they're bothered and they're just about this dream that they've had. And interestingly, that's the verb that describes how the Spirit of the Lord does that to Samson. So in a way, disturbs him, bothers him, irritates him, something. Just anyway, it's at least unique to ponder. Good.
What do you make of that? I mean,
yeah, you know, it's interesting. What do I make of it is actually a question I want to ask you. I wonder if we can just go to Judges 13.
Yeah, let me pull it up here.
Okay, so it's actually right at the end of chapter 13. So the boy grew and the Lord blessed him. Then we have the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him. So vatachel ruach Adonai lefa'amo. So when the Spirit of the Lord began lefa'amo. And so here they translate it as to stir him. Now, what's interesting is when you look at the stories where that appears, we have like in Genesis 41:8. So this is ESV here. So in the morning, his spirit was troubled, and he sent and
that's talking about Joseph, right?
This is the Pharaoh. Vahi vaboker vati pa'em, or vati pa'em, technically. Rucho. So his spirit was troubled by the dream. Vayishlach vayikra et kol. Okay, sorry. So then he calls for all these wise men to help explain this dream. And the other times this word appears as a verb is Daniel chapter 2. Verses 1 and 3. And these are still Hebrew portions, by the way. And similar thing. And then the other time is Psalm 77, where the context, you have someone who they're having a really rough night, basically. they're having one of those long nights of the soul in the valley type thing.
Yeah.
And crying out to God, right? And God answers. But he talks about how, he's so troubled he can't speak. And that word troubled there is that same one. And so it's unique. And I think some of it makes sense of his life. So what's interesting is when you go into chapter 14, it was told of him, he's going to drive out the Philistines. Okay, great. He's going to do that. But the very next story is he loves a Philistine woman. It's like, okay, there's the irony.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I first read those lines, I think, oh, come on, what's he doing? But then this is the question I have for you. Sorry to make you open up accordance one more time, but I wanted to see this verbatim. This is the part where I have a question about you when it comes to the retribution and how we understand Samson's story. So basically his parents are saying, what's the deal? There's so many good looking gals here, where we live. Why do you have to go and get connected with Philistines they're wrecking our lives and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Verse 4, though, his father and mother did not know that this was from the Lord, for he was seeking a pretext. Now, that's a pretty specific word, pretext, in the translation. I think we're worth again digging into what toana means. So again, this would give you a very specific picture. I think this verse is worth wrestling with in Hebrew a little bit more. But Va'aviv ve'imo lo yad'u ki Adonai. Sorry, I moved the verse. Where'd it go? Okay. Va'aviv ve'imo lo yad'u ki Adonai. And his father and mother did not know that this was from the Lord. Kitoanahu mevakesh mi plishtim. I want to look at that word toana. I'm curious how many times that one appears and where it appears. So anyway, this is kind of an interesting idea where at first hand we see, what's Samson doing? This doesn't make sense. He shouldn't be doing this, right? But yet we see, but this was from the Lord. And so in a way, he's working through this. Do you have any gut reaction to this? Line?
Well, I mean, again, this is how messy it gets in the Old Testament on the grammar, and especially in the Hebrew Bible. And in this particular, I think, sense, it shows that the Lord and the writer is giving us a reason as to why the Lord is doing this, is because the Lord wants to act against the Philistines. And there's really no way, I think, to parse it other than to say that even if Samson's going to go down that realm, the Lord's still going to do what he intends to do through Samson, no matter what. Wow. And I think that's the sovereign piece that we see and I think this is, in one sense, I think that's why ultimately we end up at something like the wisdom literature really challenging this question: does God have freedom to do what he wants ultimately in the midst of what he's doing in light of the covenant and Torah and all of that? And the answer is, in this case, I think yes. And I think that would be a good answer. However, the biblical text will also sort of critique that sort of stuff. So for example, I believe it's at the end of Samuel, what is it? 1 Samuel 24, 2 Samuel 24, where the Lord, it pretty much says, causes David to take a census so that he can then judge him for it. I mean, that's the idea behind it. Yeah. But then when you get to the chronicler who's reinterpreting the story, he puts the Satan in the story, right? Yeah. And says that is the one who caused, in fact, David to do what he did. And the issue is not that God's going to judge David. The issue is that it's a sin, and they don't like that the Lord had pushed him in that direction. So that's going to get murky and whatever. But here, it's fine, I guess, to really raise that question. The writer is suggesting and knows that something's not right here, but the writer wants us to know the Lord's pushing Samson in that direction in any case. And I think you have to fall back, and this is where I think it's important. You have to fall back onto the sovereignty of God. That has to be part of your theology. And I think these texts really check us when we get out of that narrative. I don't think it's all sovereignty. I don't think we all have to really press sovereignty on everything, but we still have to have sovereignty in our theology.
That's good.
Right. And when we lose it, I think these Hebrew Bible texts, they bring it right back. But these ancient Near Easterners, man, they really can write these stories And these narrators can really parse it in there. I mean, you can really, really see it. So,
Well, that's an excellent response. And I knew I was
well,
going to ask you that. And it's a tough question. I probably should have given you ahead of time, but that was a
yeah. Well, I mean,
response for that.
that's just my gut response. I'd have to do a little more research to really
Sure.
give a full on. This is what I think about it. So, yeah.
Yeah. So again, even for someone like Dr. Nathan French, who he's studied the Bible a long time and done a lot of work, it's just a good reminder for all of us as we engage with the Hebrew Bible, realizing again, this is a very ancient text, and it's not just like, oh, super simple, just read once, figure it out. It's a conversation starter.
Yeah, especially when you bring in the canon, because they're reinterpreting different moments the further you go, and so when you have that as part of the story, that's what you got to do. So,
but I think you nailed it. Just remember, it's a good reminder for all of us, though, just in general, forgetting a difficult verse, just remembering that, like as you said, you have to have sovereignty of God in your theology.
You do.
That is a pivotal part.
It is.
And how deeply we press that in to things, that's where things can maybe get a little more murky, but sovereignty of God got to be there. That's a major component.
Yeah, it is.
Good. So with Samson, we probably need to wrap up this episode there. I mean, look, I think a lot of us were familiar with the whole idea that Samson's weakness is women, and he has a number of women that he falls for, and things don't go well through, whether him manipulating people or he being manipulated by others. And it leads to him attacking and fighting against these Philistines that are ruling over this area of Israel. And it leads to some more freedom for people. And it just doesn't seem like Samson's motives are really to free Israel. It's more to just get revenge on people that he has bad stories with. And then Delilah is just simply, she's the apex. She, by the way, interestingly, she's the only woman in Samson's narrative that is given a name. His mom doesn't have a name, and the other women that he's with. So just Delilah. But so she is the apex of the story and very famous. And then he gets this revenge. But again, this thing that God works through by destroying the pillars of a building. And I guess if there's one more thing I'd want to talk about with Samson's story, at least just for now, because you can't talk about everything. Something that popped out to me in this most recent reading is the narrative about Samson and the lion, not to be confused with Delilah, but the lion, where he's traveling with his parents because he really wants to marry like a Philistine woman. And there's this lion that's lurking around, and he doesn't tell his parents, but I guess he's privy to this, like he just has better senses than them maybe or something. He goes off and he kills this lion with incredible strength. And so he takes out the lion. He doesn't tell his parents how he killed this thing or that he killed it, but he just really fought back against it. Really impressive. And so then he goes up, and then later on he comes back, and this carcass of the lion, there's some bees that have made a beehive in there, and there's honey inside. And part of being a Nazarene, like he's not supposed to come into contact with anything that's ritually unclean. That includes his carcass. So he goes in and he gets this honey. So my little thought here on this is, I wonder if this story with the lion is a bit of a microcosm for Samson's life, as well as some of the other judges. So the first part is this: is a lion is a danger to his family. And through amazing strength, he is able to go and conquer this opponent. Okay. And that's what many of the judges do, is they are being physically oppressed by the people groups, and they're able to, oftentimes through military stuff, they're able to push them back and win in victory. But what's the weakness of many of these judges, like Gideon, for example, is that they end up drawing the people and luring them into idolatry or into something that they shouldn't be doing. So for example, Samson, when he goes to this honey, he's not supposed to have this ritually impure. He also takes honey and gives it to his parents, and he does not tell them where it was from. So the parallels like to Gideon, where Gideon was someone who, again, chosen by God, he ends up through great military efforts, saving the people. But what happens at the end of the story? He ends up luring the people with a different type of gold, not gold honey, but a gold image. And he asks all of his people, give me one gold earring. And he makes an image out of it. And that ends up being a stumbling block to all of Israel.
Mhm.
It's ironic that the victory that was had was followed by this temptation that was
Mm.
also connected to a judge. So once again, I look, this is kind of reading into things, but that's kind of just something that popped out to me as maybe a microcosm of the narrative. Do you have any thoughts or responses to this little line
Yeah,
episode
well,
thing?
no, I think it's an interesting idea to bring Gideon into the picture there, because obviously that harkens back to the sin of Israel in the wilderness, right, where they make the golden calf, and you have that whole element to it with Samson. Yes, he has a thing for this Philistine woman, and that is his downfall. But there's a sense to me in which he's not happy with his vocational call anyways. Like he doesn't seem, like I said, a narrative of decline. It feels depressing somewhat that he's just sort of said, okay, yes, if you cut the locks of my hair, this is what happens. That's where my strength is. He's just getting
Mm,
closer and closer to that.
mm,
But I know I hear preachers always use that as a way of to stay away from sin or this sort of thing. But I think it's deeper than that. I think he's struggling with the call that he is been given
ooh,
from his birth in one sense. And this is true of Israel. This is true of all of us to struggle with that call and to
mm,
remain faithful to it at all times and in all places. Not so much of we always think of falling into sin as you might get there, so be careful. But it's
mm,
this embracing of the call. I think it's N.T. Wright has said something like this. Maybe that's why I'm bringing it in now. I don't know from a macro level, but he always says that Adam's sin is really a sin of vocation, just
mm.
like Israel's sin is a sin of vocation, where the Torah is the vocational call
Wow,
for Israel, and Israel cannot hold up to it,
wow.
and that's the great sin. Maybe that's the same with Samson here too, where yes, you can't touch the carcass; you'll be unclean to do so, or things in this light where you're not being true to your duties, I guess, in the vocational call that you have, and that's where I would go with that. And I think that
That's really good.
whether yeah, and whether the narrators are meaning to do that or not, or whether the writers are intending for us to get that sense in the way that they've laid out the story, nevertheless, I think it does come through. So.
I think that's a really good point to kind of close on. I hadn't thought of that, but I think there's a lot of truth there. And going a really practical direction now, this makes me think
Mhm.
about my parents. They are basically, you call them full-time life coaches is what they do. And their big thing is helping people with specifically freedom, purpose, and love. Those are the big things they want to help people through. And
Mm.
they take people through basically whether they do individuals or small groups, they take them through kind of you could say a curriculum, I guess, that they've made pretty straightforward and simple.
Mhm.
One of the big components that my dad has come to really believe is that some of the biggest reasons why we get into coping and addiction is not really because of the lure of coping and addiction itself, but because we doubt and question our purpose
Mm.
because of either something that we have done or something that someone has done to us that
Mm.
causes us to think my story's over. I
Mm.
don't have purpose. I don't have meaning.
Mm.
And that ends up leading people into that place. So it's interesting you bring up the questioning of our calling. And I really
Mm.
do think it's something that we all will wrestle with at some point. I think I go to Second Timothy with Paul writing to Timothy and saying, keep ablaze the gift of God, which is
Yeah, that's
inside of
good.
you.
That's
For
good.
God
Yeah.
has not given you a spirit of timidity or fear, but a power, love, and a sound mind.
Yeah.
So I think this is a good encouragement for all of us to hold on to that purpose, to that calling that you
Mhm.
have on your life. And I think for many of us, when we get off track, I think sometimes we can get a little too obsessed about thinking, man, I think I have sin in my life, or I think I have a problem in my life. That's true. We do need to acknowledge those areas and
Mhm.
work strategically around that. But again, going to Paul again, walk in the spirit and you won't fulfill the lust of the flesh. I think sometimes we
Precisely.
approach our lives more like, don't fulfill the lust of the flesh, like avoid the million bad things, and then I'll
Mhm.
do good, as opposed to focusing on what's that calling, what's that
Mhm.
purpose,
Mhm.
and pursuing
And
that.
and what is the spirit bidding you to do, right? I mean, that's
Yeah.
and where is he leading? And I think that's the big key of it. And of course, with Samson, it ends. with him sort of re-embracing that calling again,
Yes.
as he ends as his life ends, and what he does and what he's remembered for doing for Israel at the very end of his life. So
That's excellent. All right. Well, this was a fun conversation. I enjoyed this. Very
yeah,
good.
this was
So,
great. Who would
so
have thought Samson, Shimshon, we get there. So from
who would have thought?
Canaanite sun gods to Mesopotamian sun gods, and here we are. So
Yep. Here we are. What a fun episode. All right. Well, thank you all for listening and watching. And be sure to check out some of our other content you can find us again on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, podcast platforms for all kinds of content, everything that's 30-second videos to an hour-long discussion or even something in between, and stuff that you can get for yourself as well as people trying to help make sense of the Hebrew Bible. Thanks for joining us.